Good evening. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people, of elders past and present, on which this meeting takes place. Welcome to the second Melbourne Energy Institute Energy Futures Seminar Series for 2012. Into our third year now, this series brings together the perspectives of academia, government and industry about energy future issues. We are very pleased to be partnering with the Grattan Institute again and are honoured to have a panel with significant experience in the business in coal and gas this evening. The panel will discuss the issues raised by our speaker, Associate Professor Michael Brear, and will then take questions from the audience. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of tonight's panel, Mr. Tony Wood. Tony is the Director of the Grattan Institute Energy Program, having joined Grattan after 2.5 years at the Clinton Foundation, prior to that spending 11 years with Origin Energy. He has an expert understanding of what keeps our energy supply sector ticking and has built widespread relationships in industry and is a trusted advisor to government. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Susanna. I think this is probably, for the ones I've attended of our series so far, one of the most attended, and we certainly had if all the people who'd registered turned up, some of you would be sitting on each other's shoulders by now. I suspect that illustrates that this is actually a subject in which people are deeply interested, because it goes to the heart of some of the challenges that we in Australia, but also other parts of the world, are facing, and how we start to change our energy system from what we have today to what I think is generally accepted as being a very different system in the future. And there are wide variation of views as to what this is going to look like. We've had, in our series so far, we've discussed, and some of you may have attended previous seminars, we have discussed issues to do with solar, with transport, with nuclear, we've discussed carbon pricing. There are 2 more seminars to go this year, and Susanna will refer to those later. But the heart of this is particularly for a country like Australia, where we have historically used so much of our energy, electricity particularly, coming from coal and gas. We also, as many of you would know, export a very large amount of coal and gas. Arguably, on the gas side, we're going to be becoming very shortly one of the largest producers globally of LNG. And I think historically, and probably still today, coal has been one of the major exporters in terms of earning export income for this country. So we've got, as a country, a very strong vested interest in what's going to happen here and how this plays out. The idea of the format of this evening is that Michael Brear, Michael is the ARC Future Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Michael also has been involved in organising the Masters of Energy Systems program at the university here, and that's turning out to be a very popular program. So it suggests that he's got some runs on the board already. Michael will spend about 20 minutes laying out his view of what the challenges are for coal and gas in Australia. And remember, the major focus of tonight is to talk about what this means in the Australian context for coal and gas. And then we'll then ask Nikki Williams and David Byers to comment or respond to some of the points that Michael has brought out in his presentation for about 5 to 10 minutes each. Nikki Williams is the Chief Executive Officer for the Australian Coal Association. Before that, Nikki worked for the Minerals Council in New South Wales, and she's had a long history in this sector. And David Byers is currently the Chief Executive of APPEA, which represents the oil and gas exploration and production industry, and in particular represents the interests of the gas industry from an industry perspective. And David's also taken on that role reasonably recently, but he also has had a long history having in the industry, previously working with Exxon, and has also worked as the CEO for CEDA for a number of years. So there are 2 people here who are particularly expert in their fields. They will respond, as I said, to the comments that Michael will make, and then we'll have a brief conversation, which I'll ask them a couple of further questions to get some conversation going, and then we'll throw it open to you to raise questions, make comments, and hopefully get a discussion around some of the issues that you'd like to think about or have them respond to in the questions of what is likely to be the future of coal and gas, and what should be, and what should we be doing about that. I'm expecting there should be a wide range of views on that topic, and hopefully we can have a useful conversation and exchange of views. So that will take us through, and the objective is to finish pretty close to 8 o'clock. So look, without any further introduction from me, let me hand over to Michael. Michael will lay out how he, from a more academic perspective, sees the future of coal and gas and what are some of the issues that are going to frame whether coal and gas has the future or not in Australia's energy industry and what might be the influences on that. As I said, Nikki and David will then respond to what Michael has put on the table, and we'll see where we go from there. Apart from thinking seriously and having a conversation about what the issues are in respect of the future of coal and gas in this country, there's no other particular agenda, and I'm happy to see where the conversation takes us. So with that, I'll pass over to Michael.
Is the microphone okay? Good. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a mechanical engineer here in the University of Melbourne, and I've been given the privilege of kicking off tonight's proceedings. So I just want to start by framing tonight's discussion with a reasonably obvious statement. We have a lot of coal and natural gas, and that generates significant revenue for both our industry and government. No surprises there. Second, demand for our coal and gas is currently strong, but there's perhaps some, we know that there's global economic uncertainty, we all know that. There's also perhaps some evidence of stronger competition from other sources of cheap gas from other parts of the world, particularly the United States. Unconventional gas sources are being potentially exported to the Asia-Pacific region, and its impact on our own exports. So first question, which I'll come back to later on tonight, is how fragile is our economy then if we export a lot of coal and natural gas to our neighbours to the north? Of course, another uncontroversial statement is the need for us to significantly reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions. That poses other interesting questions to Australia in particular. First thing, if we're large exporters of coal and natural gas, how do we reconcile the fact that we need to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions with some of our major exports? And the second is, if there is global action on climate change, what might that do to us economically? And finally, I just want to raise a point, because I think in this debate, many people tend to be over-optimistic. Tends not to be technology specific. Most people who are supporters of given technologies tend to think their own technology is pretty good. And there's plenty of evidence historically for centuries that we generally tend to underestimate the difficulty, cost, and indeed the slow pace of change of the energy system. And if that's the case, how do we then address these difficulties, these higher costs than expected, these slower paces of transition than expected, in a rational way, of course including cost-effective abatement, such that we can achieve the right environmental outcomes? We don't want to waste money on unsound investments. So here's a chart which was given to me this afternoon by Professor Sandiford, which was quite remarkable. I previously presented some old data to my master's students 3 or 4 weeks ago, not the latest data. Here is the annual production on an energy equivalent basis globally of oil, coal and gas. And as you can see, 2011 is when the coal and oil basically are on a par. Now, the remarkable thing to students of this stuff is that coal lost its leadership on an energy equivalent basis to oil in about 1965. It took over from wood in about 1880, 1890. So coal looks to be becoming king again, as they used to refer to it, king coal, possibly, by Mike's best estimate, today. A remarkable plot demonstrating this massive growth of global coal production in particular. Now, that's the global coal production. What does that mean for our own country? Well, on the left, here is 2010 exports. Iron ore, coal are clearly our dominant export earners, followed by what might be a surprise to some of you, education, our third largest export. So quite literally, in terms of Australia, education is more valuable than gold, but not as valuable as coal and iron ore. That's a bad joke, obviously prepared. Now, that's the total exports this country earns 2010. Coal and iron ore are the biggies. Now, of that coal, I'm not sure of the proportions. Nikki will know it much better than I will. That coal is both thermal coal, stuff that's used, stuff that's burned to make electricity primarily, and also metallurgical coal, which is used to make steel with iron ore. Okay? Both of those, of course, very CO2 intensive processes. Now, on the right, we have our federal government company tax revenue from the same period. Financial services, number one, largely, of course, not an export-based thing, done from domestic transactions. Mining, number two. What is a little added complexity there is that state royalties, particularly those in Western Australia and Queensland, are comparable, 6 to 7 billion, I think, to our mining revenue federally. So the federal government gets that company tax revenue, the states get their royalties, and it's a similar number. And then as of Sunday, I think, the 1st of July, when the Minerals Resource Rent Tax and the extended form of the Petroleum Resources Rent Tax come into effect, Treasury estimates another 3 or 4 billion a year initially coming into the federal government when those schemes become active. Nonetheless, big dollars both for industry and for government. And last time I checked, I'm paid by the federal government, so these exports pay my salary, and I'm guessing a few of you too. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's exports. What about domestically? So here is some relatively recent data from the Federal Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency of Australia's national CO2 equivalent emissions. You can see December 2011, electricity does about 200 megatons of CO2 equivalent. You might see, quite surprisingly, a peak in about December in 2008. So we've actually been dropping our CO2 emissions from electricity since then. But of course, electricity is not our only consumer of fossil fuels. That's primarily coming from coal, but also from natural gas. It's not our only consumer of fossil fuels. Stationary energy is, for example, running big natural gas boilers and so on and so forth in manufacturing plants and refineries and so on and so forth. And then, of course, transportation isn't a big coal consumer anymore. Steam trains aren't around much, but some gas in transportation, but not a great deal. The one I do want to point out, though, is agriculture. Now, we are perhaps reasonably well aware of the fugitive emissions that come from cows and other ruminants being the main source of CO2 equivalent emissions of agriculture. What's perhaps less obvious is the land on which they are grazed is, of course, fertilised in large amount from inorganic nitrogen-based fertilisers. That's generally made from natural gas and substantially boosts the agricultural yields. So the food the cows eat is, in a sense, enhanced or significantly enhanced by natural gas, and they then themselves produce more CO2 equivalent emissions. So fossil fuels are endemic throughout our economy. Now, I just want to talk, because I'm an engineering academic, I have to show one equation. All right, and I've tried. My wife said, only show them one equation, don't show them two equations, they'll fall asleep. But I just want to show one equation, and that's a very simple equation on the greenhouse gas intensity from the Australian electricity network. This could be any country's electricity network, but let's just think about us for the moment.